Welcome to the Sage Family Podcast, where we explore natural homeschooling, gentle parenting,
simple living, and family adventure.
I'm Rachel Rainbolt, the Sage Family Mentor, coming to you from an island in the Pacific Northwest, where I live wild and free in connection with my hilarious husband and 3 growing sailors in our fixer-upper on the beach. So join us around the campfire and let's get living the family life of our dreams. This is episode 94, and today I'm here with Rose Hackman talking about emotional labor. Rose is a British journalist in Detroit and the author of Emotional Labor, The Invisible Work Shaping Our Lives and How to Claim Our Power. This incredible episode was spurred from a lot of remarkable work happening inside the Sage Family Village, where we are learning to recognize our emotional labor in action, value it, and identify the edges of our ownership over it, stepping into empowered choice around what space we are willing to occupy and what space we are not. If anything about this episode resonates with you, join us over at sagefamily.com/village. Welcome to the show, Rose. Will you introduce yourself and share a bit about who you are and what you're passionate about?
Sure. So my name is Rose Hackman. I am a journalist and author, I guess, at this point, based in Detroit. As you can probably hear, I am a British journalist, but I've been in the US at this point for about 13 years. So the US is really my home now. Let's see, what am I passionate about? I am very clearly passionate about obscured systemic inequality, including systemic inequality that rarely gets acknowledged as such. And I think emotional labor, which is not just a book that I wrote, but a topic that I spent 8 years pouring into, gets to the heart of a lot of hidden inequalities that don't just exist across society, but often within the realms of our own homes.
Yes. Okay. Let's dive in. What is emotional labor? Let's start there. What is it?
So emotional labor, I'll give you the elevator pitch in terms of what it is from just a day-to-day perspective, and then I'll give you a tiny bit of background in terms of how it's been studied, if that's okay.
Perfect.
So, emotional labor is the editing work of feelings that a person will do on themselves in order to have an effect on the feelings of other people. So most commonly, you might think of it as a smile that you will give to the people around you in order to make them feel good, regardless of whether you're feeling good inside. In our society, this is a form of work that is highly feminized. We don't just offload it onto women. We expect it of women. We expect it of women chronically. It's also sometimes racialized in dynamics where there's lots of different races involved. People who are not white are going to be expected to do it more. It's thoroughly invisibilized. We don't really see it. It's devalued. And yet what I argue in the book and what I've been arguing ever since it's come out is it's one of the most valuable forms of work that exists, because it's the form of work that keeps our society, our communities, our families functional, happy, thriving. So if I quickly can go into the origin of the actual term, it was coined by a sociologist about 40 years ago called Ali Hochschild, who is kind of an extraordinary scholar. At the time, it was the early 80s. She was trying to define a form of work that had permeated workplaces, their economy, but we hadn't yet understood it as a form of work. She specifically looked at the work of flight attendants and posited that a flight attendant basically doing a good job was not so much handing out snacks and drinks on the plane, but was conveying a specific feeling, a feeling of safety, of care. She called that emotional labor, that according to her and many, many academics since, is everywhere in the service sector specifically. And she equated it with something that she said we had long been accustomed to seeing women provide in private, which was what she called at the time emotion work. Emotional labor and emotion work as the same form of work in popular discourse is now really referred to as the same thing, emotional labor, whether it's paid or unpaid. That is the big background, and you're ready to know everything now.
Why is it so taboo to talk about?
Honestly, I mean, subjectively, I think it shouldn't be taboo to talk about it. But I know from experience, from many years of talking about it, that it's extraordinarily taboo. People get very, very offended at the idea that anything approaching emotions could constitute work. When people have that initial gut reaction, what I try and invite them to do is go to the workplace and think of the millions upon millions of jobs that rely centrally on the worker performing emotional labor for a fee. So if you think of a customer care representative, they're not just there to solve your problem, they're there to make you feel cared for. And in fact, when people still resist, I invite them to think, what would it be like if a nurse, a teacher, a customer care representative, a home health aide stopped providing emotional labor and actually acted very rude, very unbothered, very uncaring, unloving? You would think they were doing a very bad job. So the absence of emotional labor, especially in the workplace, makes you realize how key and central it is to so many jobs. And in the informal, workplace, in homes, honestly, the absence of emotional labor also makes you understand how important and vital it is for the smooth running of everything when it comes to a family. So if you think of the idea of maybe a mother who stops being even-keeled and thoughtful and preemptively thoughtful and endlessly empathetic and patient, that mother would be seen or would maybe even feel like she wasn't fully providing for the people around her. Emotional labor, it's real. It's just when you start talking about it as real, really what you start to do is you start to understand all of the hidden value that so many people who have been taught that what they're providing is just their essence and not real work. You start to see all of that work and that value that is being provided. And honestly, I think a lot of the seams of society and the way in which we've built society start to become a bit undone. It makes people very uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. In a way that they should be made uncomfortable so that we can deconstruct a lot of this.
Right.
So in the context that I'm often living and working in, emotional labor is often attributed to being an inherent sex-based trait. Like you were saying, like it's just the essence of being a mother or of being a woman. My experience is that it is a skill set that I was forced to learn to survive. And if I wasn't performing it, others would be forced to grow into it. What does the research tell us about that?
So the research tells us it's kind of mixed when it comes to empathy. There's a lot of research that shows that women tend to be better, let's say, at empathy. And if you think of empathy in action as effectively a way of thinking about emotional labor, it's a good way into understanding it. But really, when neuroscientists and psychologists start to understand or start to question, why is it that women and girls often in papers and academic research are found to be better at empathy, they find that women and girls only tend to be better at performing empathy when they are cued off that they are supposed to be performing an other-oriented trait. Neuroscience over the last really 20 years has really progressed leaps and bounds in terms of understanding the plasticity of the brain and the way in which we're motivated to perform certain behaviors or traits. And the path of least resistance for most of us, for our brains, is to adhere to whatever expectations we realize are around us. So as women and girls, we are expected to be endlessly other-oriented, to put other people before us. And so if we understand that, for example, in a neuroscience or a psychology test, we are being tested on those kinds of traits, we will make more of an effort to be good at it. But in all sorts of research that kind of goes beyond that. Neuroscientists understanding that empathy is actually motivational as opposed to innate. They try and come up with ways to motivate everyone else into performing empathy. And what the research, again, over the last really decade or two shows is that men and boys, when given the right motivation, are able to perform just as much empathy and be just as empathetic as girls and women. The thing that's lacking for them is the motivation as things stand. And for women and girls, it's not just that we're motivated into performing the stereotypical traits of our gender. It's also that we're policed if we don't. We're often punished. If a woman is seen as selfish, that is a really terrible thing. If a man is seen as selfish, he's probably seen to be, a go-getter and potentially aggressive, and, he's going to go far in life. So there's all sorts of mechanisms at play that are often forcing us and reinforcing this kind of trait being not just learned, but chronically performed. In fact, empathy in action, love, care, those are all things, all skills that are intrinsically human. It's just, that's one group that's really being encouraged to do it. And there's another group that's being either discouraged or it's really not an issue either way.
Yeah. And we're getting that, like, those traits are being selected for in very real ways. Like if I'm, in a situation where there's a large male in the space with me and it's nighttime and I'm alone, I'm going to be doing a lot of extra emotional labor to make sure that he is at ease and feeling non-threatened and in a really emotionally good place. I'm going to be smiling. I'm going to be taking care of, even if it's like he's just on the other side of a counter at a convenience store, I'm doing all of that emotional labor to keep myself safe. So even in a very violence-based, survival, I guess I'm saying, from an evolutionary perspective, I feel like I have, even on a subconscious level, I'm sure, I'm performing that labor to stay alive.
You're completely right. And that's why I always say that emotional labor, we think of it as being tied to gender, but in fact, it's tied to power. And because we do live in a patriarchy, so many of us women, once girls, have been trained to understand that boys and then men can be potentially dangerous for us. So of course, we're going to want to placate their feelings and cater to their needs and experiences and emotions. And, not that long ago, men really were the ones who had all the economic power. And Arlie Hochschild, back in the 1980s, when she came up with the term, she said, this is going to slightly misquote her, but effectively she talked about women as lacking in material resources. We make a resource out of the feelings that we have in order to compensate for those material resources that men possess and that we lack. And of course, we have far more opportunities. I certainly do than my mother. My mother didn't go to college. I was afforded a college education. That's a huge difference over a lifetime. But when you look at the realities of how families still function in the West, in America, overwhelmingly in heterosexual households, when people have children, it's going to be, even in dual income households, it's going to be the women who are going to either go part-time or stay at home to care for the kids, because we do not have proper universal childcare in this country. So a lot of these kinds of inequalities that might, to some, feel antiquated are still very much the reality day to day for a lot of households, where if a man is the one who's still making the majority of the income, there shouldn't be, I don't think, because of course, a woman who is not formally working is still actually working, but there can feel like there's a form of an imbalance that a woman is then forced into compensating for and placating again that male partner, maybe in the same way that you just talked about placating the man across the counter.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when a woman has young children and it feels like their survival and well-being is dependent upon the goodwill of a male partner who is the sole income earner in a family, even if that male partner has not given any tangible, like, has never threatened to leave them destitute. Like the patriarchal dynamics still exist, and that can still be a reality, that if that partner gets angry, there is a risk of violence, even if it's never happened. Like, our DNA knows that, like, or there is a risk of abandonment. And then how can you feed your children? So I think it's helpful to like acknowledge those dynamics at play. A lot of times it's hard for us to give language to like a felt sense, and really being able to zoom out and look at like all of these factors, I think, can be really helpful and validating and make you feel not so crazy for like having those feelings and for feeling the need to do all of that extra labor.
I think you're completely right. I think it's incredibly important to acknowledge that, for all the progress that we've made. And I do not equate emotional labor inequality with abusive households, but very often abusive households are accommodated through overwhelming amounts of emotional labor taken on in heterosexual dynamics by a female partner, because the abuse tends to be coming from the male partner, statistically speaking. And that's not to say that, as I mentioned just now, that emotional labor inequality is necessarily at all a reflection of a kind of an extreme dynamic, but it can certainly be reflective of one. And that is a reality, but beyond the kind of extreme of even emotionally abusive households, because we do not live in a society that really teaches men, boys and men, it's not just to regulate their emotions, which is a form of emotional labor. It's one step to emotional labor, because emotional labor requires you to understand your emotions and then regulate them and then express them in a specific way, paying attention to the way in which they're going to have an impact on your surroundings. The first step, which is identifying your feelings, your emotions, emotion literacy, is something that we've really lagged behind when it comes to boys and men. And what happens when you don't teach a whole group of people to understand their emotions is they become extremely emotionally dysregulated. And so in adult men, the outbursts and the temper tantrums do tend to be on that side of things. And again, in a heterosexual dynamic, it then tends to be a woman who's tasked with modulating that partner's expression, especially, as you just mentioned, when there are kids involved and you're trying to be a buffer between that temper and that mood and your own children.
A buffer, yes. That is the experience of a lot of mothers that I work with. There was a study in your book that you mentioned that talked about how they can like create this dynamic of one person being the emotional laborer in men if they're subservient to someone else, which I found was like fascinating and explaining sort of some of the dynamics that, like, if you identify someone as being in a subservient role, their emotional labor skills suddenly they show up.
Right. So that's again, it goes back to the power conversation. And I think it can be so, on the one end, it can be a bit depressing, but on the other end, I actually find it to be very liberating, because you understand how malleable and not fixed these dynamics are. Mm-hmm. So, and this might seem a bit controversial, but there's been a bunch of studies that look into how real women's intuition is. There's going to be a caveat at the end, because I do think we have intuition, but let me first start with the studies. So I think this is potentially one of the studies you're referring to. Researchers looking to understand whether women's intuition were real created what they call dyads, which is pairings, regardless of gender, where sometimes dyads where there was one superior entity and one submissive entity person. And sometimes a male participant was seen as the dominant participant, and with a female who was a submissive participant. And sometimes it was vice versa. You had a female participant who was told, you're the dominant one, and the male one was the submissive one. And what the study found is gender really didn't play much of a role, but what did play a role in terms of having good intuition, i.e., guessing what the other person was going through and being able to describe what the other person was going through, the better person at intuiting the other person's feelings was always the submissive one, regardless of gender. And I think that makes sense, going back to your to your example. If you see someone who might be a threat to you, and you don't necessarily hold a huge amount of power, you're going to try and figure out what they're going through and accommodate them in their presence, so that you can honestly figure out for survival, what you need to do, how you need to be reacting to that person's emotional expressions. And, beyond that, in a kind of a slightly more hilarious way to me, a lot of traditional, maybe men might come home. Certainly men I interviewed in the book would say to me, I'm not an emotional person, so emotional labor is not relevant to me. But then, that same person would go to work and is not the boss, and would have to measure their tone with their bosses and with their colleagues, and would have to be polite and accommodating to clients and customers. And that's emotional labor. So, and again, that goes with the power differential that we're talking about. So there's a lot of ways in which this doesn't even play out in these terrible ways that really reveal that everyone is able to do it given the right motivation. And at this point, because we don't value emotional labor enough, it really does tend to have something to do with a position in the hierarchy, basically.
Yes. Okay, emotional labor itself is not the problem. And in fact, we need more emotional labor in the world. The problem is that there should be an equal distribution of labor, and it should be acknowledged and it should be valued, as opposed to extracted from minority groups like women and people of color. Do I have that right? Am I on the right track here?
You've got that perfectly right. We're definitely not going for a world with less emotional labor. The problem really is right now is that emotional labor is not seen, is that the people who are doing most of the emotional labor are not, it's not just that their work is not seen, it's they're not given the worth that they're due. I think for a lot of people, this came to a head during the pandemic, and it's kind of fascinating because we've almost just reverted back to how we were before, and we've forgotten just how suddenly it became completely apparent that over-relying, for example, on women and feminized groups to carry the load of basically caring for everyone, and whether it's parents or children or both or neighbors, I've been thinking a lot about the future of work. And actually, I had an article in the Washington Post a couple of months ago about this specifically. It used to be that we thought that manufacturing, i.e. physical labor, was really the kind of big form of work that was going to get automated. And of course, over the last year and a bit, we've finally started having conversations because of ChatGPT making its entrance into the mainstream. We're finally starting to have conversations about the fact that intellectual labor is actually highly replaceable too, which I think a lot of men are very kind of up in arms about the idea that, these fancy lawyers and, bankers and doctors actually at the end of the day have highly replaceable skills is obviously something that's quite offensive to some. But the fact of the matter is, if you can read it in a book and put it in a book, you put it into a computer and it can be replaced. But what can't be replaced is human to human interaction. As human beings, as babies, the number one thing that they need, and anyone who's been a caregiver to a young child knows this, they need to feel love and safety and a sense of belonging and meaning. And they need help as they grow older to make sense of the world and to make sense of their relationship with the world. And that cannot really be done by anyone except for another human being. So I'm hopeful, I'm very, very hopeful that as we start to have new conversations about the future of work, we can finally really, really place the value on the form of work that cannot be replaced, which I believe is, the heart of a lot of emotional labor.
That is such a brilliant perspective, and I hadn't even thought about it that way. That is absolutely so true. I think it's so helpful to understand that like people doing emotional labor is not the problem. Like that is a huge value add. That is what makes us human, really. That's connection. We all need that, and we need more of that in the world. It's just that it needs to be acknowledged and it needs to be valued. I've had a lot of podcast episodes recently where I've talked about co-regulation, which is sort of the polyvagal theory term for how my nervous system connects to my child's, or really it's to any other humans. And like I regulate their emotional state through the regulation of my own. And I've been talking about it a lot on like episode after episode. And I keep saying like, I need this, like I've been sort of dancing around it, that like, this is the most significant thing I do as a mother. And it feels invisible. Like you can't, like most people don't know that it's happening when it's happening. Most people don't know that it exists. And it is the most energetically draining. I mean, also feels amazing and it produces incredible results, but like it feels invisible. And I need the whole world to understand, like when they see my relationship with my children, or, you know, and I say like co-regulate, like this is a massive part of how this happens. Like, it just feels like it's been completely invisible. And I'm like shouting from the rooftops, like, can everybody please acknowledge that this is the meat of how this happens? Like, it's not about like what words I say or what parents, you know, consequences. Like, no, it's not about any of that. It's this emotional labor, and no one sees it. No one acknowledges it, and no one values it. And yet it's like the single most important thing that I literally do as a mother.
Right. That's such a massive, important point. And I think that, again, I mean, this is almost like tricks to get people to believe you, which we shouldn't have to do. But, you know, just going back to the same thing as like, if you had a really angry customer care representative, you would think they'd be doing a terrible job and they're not doing emotional labor. It's kind of the same with what you're describing in terms of your co-regulation. If you weren't doing that with your kids, and your kids were just like, you know, all like going all
exploding.
Over exactly, then I'm sure that you would get a lot of feedback. You know, it's what's kind of tragic as things stand is doing emotional labor really, really well often makes it, as things stand, unseen, whereas doing emotional labor pretty poorly is when you start to kind of, you know.
Yes.
So I'm very, very hopeful that across the spectrum, within family context, with children and beyond, you know, within professional context, just on the street, we can start to use these words, and we can start to make them much more mainstream as opposed to just studied in obscure halls of academia, you know, because they are, for so many of us in different ways, how we lead our, you know, the most time consuming parts of our days.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because when I was, adults always described me as being so maternal and like a mother, like when I was a child, like long before I was a mother. And when I watch back like videos of me in my childhood now, of course, I can't really parse apart what is what, but I'm just thinking like, how sad that this little girl had to take care of the emotions of everyone around her, you know, and I do that like now. And I just, it feels very essential and important that like I am aware of it when I'm doing it. And I am aware that this is labor that I am choosing to gift this person that I am interacting with. And it would sure be great if society was able to see it, you know, in action when it shows up, and to value it too.
Totally. I have a couple of points. The first is, you know, one of the pushbacks I get, or I've received over the years in terms of emotional labor being controversial, is, again, how could you make emotions into work? The flip side is corporations are making a hell of a lot of money off of the emotional labor of their employees, often in exploitative ways, precisely because it is so taboo to think of emotions as something that should be paid for. The example, as you know, because you've very kindly read the book, at the beginning of the book that really brings this home, servers, who work for tips. Establishments do not really pay them, or do not generally pay them really a living wage. But establishments rely on the emotional labor of these servers, them being agreeable to customers, them not just taking orders, but creating a whole experience. Establishments rely on this emotional labor in order to attract customers and turn a profit. So the question is not, should we pay for emotional labor? Is who does the value of emotional labor end up going to? And as things stand, so often the value of the emotional labor created doesn't go back to the person who's doing it. In fact, because we so often see these traits as submissive traits, sometimes, and this is what's heartbreaking, people doing the essential emotional labor, even in friendships, to keep the friendships going, are kind of maybe even seen as like, maybe certainly taken for granted. Maybe they're the less charismatic ones in the group or whatever it is. We see them that way. And I think that's totally wrong. And if we were not being hypocritical, we would see that actually even in those small dynamics, and I brought up friendships because, you're talking about you before you become a parent. And I think that these emotional labor dynamics that sometimes are, have nothing to do with nuclear families, are just kind of, they come out. They so often reflect the skewed values that society imposes on us. Ideally, when even a 12-year-old, I have an older sister, Alice, I'm one of three. Alice was an extraordinary emotional labor. When you talk of yourself as a good emotional laborer, I think of Alice. Alice used to come up with stories to tell us as kids. She would, if we were traveling and we were all sleeping in the same bedroom, she'd kind of like tell us like comforting things to go to sleep. Alice is kind of the quiet, shy one. She's the other-oriented one. And so often as a kid, I saw her and her gifts that she was giving to the people around her be demeaned. So I guess what I'm getting to is, in an ideal society, there's a kind of a shift of values across the board, not just in terms of parents teaching boys just as much as girls to understand their emotions and to be other-oriented, but also in terms of rewarding and seeing it, including, among little children who are kind of, how amazing that a 12-year-old, knew to invent stories to put us to sleep. That's kind of beautiful to me.
Yes. Okay. Let's talk about men in this conversations, because men benefit from this system, but they're also harmed by it, right? Why should they make changes, and what kind of changes can they make?
That's a wonderful question. There's a whole chapter dedicated to men in the book called What About the Men, which is called What About the Men because as a journalist, I used to write about gender. I was writing for The Guardian for quite a few years, and I would always get comments and emails after I wrote anything about gender saying, but what about the men? We are also, yes, it's true. Yes, let's go back to centering men for a second. Men are also victims in a patriarchy. The kind of social contract of patriarchy is not that all men will win. It's that some men will win, and the big winners will all be men. And then there kind of is a promise within patriarchy that you might not be a winner out in the world, but you'll get to dominate your household and you'll get to exert all of the kind of tyrannical traits of maybe the guy who's actually at the top of the pyramid dominating the whole of society. But domination and obsession with hierarchy and aggression and competitiveness is not just alienating to women who are really the buffers of pain in this very violent system. It's obviously very violent to men because it's teaching men that in order to access any kind of power, they've got to dominate. They've got to kind of not just alienate others, but alienate parts of themselves. And, you said it earlier, we do not teach boys, or we said it earlier, we do not teach boys within our current system. I'm sure all your listeners do teach boys to understand their emotions. But society does not reward boys who have a vast emotional literacy. Society, sadly, still encourages boys to be stoic. So really the one form of emotional labor that is drummed into boys in conservative traditional environments is emotion suppression. That is the one form of emotional labor that is acceptable. And obviously that has extremely negative impacts, not just on themselves, but on the people around them as they grow older. When I talked to psychologists about this, they were unequivocal in saying men and women, girls and boys, all humans are relational. We all rely on one another in order to survive. We all need connection to one another in order to survive. That is not gendered, that is human. So when we're teaching boys that they have to just suppress and they do not get to understand themselves, and actually it's kind of dangerous for them to relate to other people too much because they'll be seen as soft, or they'll be seen, in homophobic environments, they'll be seen as a sissy, or, there is this heartbreaking fear that boys should not be close to their mums because boys who are close to their mums might turn out gay, and wouldn't that be terrible? And obviously it isn't, but that is the homophobic kind of thought. So they're cut off from themselves, they're cut off from the rest of their environments, and they actually grow up, statistically speaking, terribly emotional, but only in one way, which is either suppressing or, emotional outbursts that are not regulated. The irony being, of course, that we talk about girls and women as being the emotional ones, as if it's a bad thing, but actually being in touch with our emotions means that we understand them. We can then regulate them, as you know, as someone who co-regulates. And then we're able to kind of pass and filter to understand how it can, the impact and the way in which we want to affect our environment. So boys and men, it's there's all this literature that says that there's this terrible crisis of loneliness. We certainly know from the statistics that suicide is a very real problem. Deaths of desperation have been on the rise for the last decade. That is predominantly among men, overwhelmingly among men. Social isolation, a lack of connectivity with other people, is a huge problem for men. And that is why not expecting or even teaching boys and then men to do emotional labor is not just potentially dangerous to the people around them, it's also extremely dangerous for the boys and then men themselves. So there's a huge case to be made for emotional labor to be spread out, not just in terms of justice and fairness for girls and women, but in terms of allowing men to live full, long lives. There's all these studies that show the more connections and friendships and meaningful relationships we have, including / especially men, the longer we live.
Yes. I feel like I say that after everything you say. I'm like, oh, yes. Yes. Okay. If we want to make our relationships more egalitarian, what can we do to begin that shift, particularly in the face of potential resistance from a partner?
I think there needs to be a base acknowledgement that emotional labor, I'm not even going, it's seen. We need to acknowledge that emotional labor is real. Like, is the first step. And it's kind of sad that's the first step. That is why I took years and years to write this book, in huge part because I am so used to being dismissed. When I wrote for The Guardian, I did structural inequality. I wrote about housing and racism and policing and the environment and gender. And there is no topic that I got more resistance on than gender. Everything else is can be uncomfortable for people to contend with, but they'll have to accept that it's reality. Gender, you're starting from a base point where everyone's immediately telling you it's nonsense, and they're not even engaging with any of the facts or the research. So the reason I took years, and I mean years of my life to write this book, is I wanted to have all of the receipts so that no one could tell anyone who was explaining what emotional labor was that it was not, it was just like, a figment of their imagination. So I want anyone having the conversation to have the security that this is not BS. Emotional labor is real. It has tangible impacts on the lives of the people around us. It takes time, effort, and skill to be performed, just like any other form of work. Just like physical labor, intellectual labor, and creative labor, emotional labor takes time, effort, and skill. It can be measured with time, in fact. If you're co-regulating with your child, that is something that you have to kind of be present, and you can't be doing lots of other things, and it's going to take the time that it takes. And as you say, it then has an impact. It might even be draining as much as it can be rewarding. So the first part of it is it's real. And if you need studies, you can go to the footnotes in the book.
It's like the tooth fairy. I think in conversations with people, I've been like, it's like the tooth fairy. Like, I put the money under the pillow. Like everyone who doesn't do that work can say like, it's magic. Like, that's great. Like, you want to keep believing it's a magical fairy, but I'm the one that has to stay up late and put the money under the pillow.
That's exactly it. And honestly, I mean, this is such a kind of an old school example, but like Christmas, if you celebrate Christmas, or just the holiday seasons, like those moments and feelings are not just magically conveyed, which is what I think a lot of people want to think. Yeah. They are produced with a lot of time, effort, and skill, and planning, and delegation, if you're lucky. So that's the first thing, it's real. And then the next thing is you need to start to talk about not just seeing it, but valuing it and seeing it as just like, not just like one form of work. It needs to kind of get high up on the, family hierarchy in terms of what is being provided. And, I think for those of us who are in heterosexual dynamics, I just got married 10 days ago to a man. So I'm in a, I'm in one of those households. I think it's important to think not just about emotional labor in terms of something that should be perfectly equal. Ideally, there's a kind of a open-ended reciprocity and mutuality in an ideal situation where you're not necessarily counting tit for tat, but you are taking ownership of your own emotional needs, but also understanding that you're part inextricably of an emotional network. And you cannot extract yourself from that emotional network. The men who I interviewed for the book, he said, I don't need emotional labor because I'm not emotional.
Just means the women around them are doing it for them.
Exactly. And they don't, if you are unless you are out in the middle of the countryside all by yourself, in which case you probably especially need help. But if you are living with people, whether it's children or fellow adults, you are engaging in an emotional network that you are a part of, and you have to hold yourself responsible for the way in which you are having an emotional impact on the other people around you. You have to hold yourself responsible for your feelings. And then ideally, the people around you, especially the adults, are also going to be doing the same thing. And if you are co-parenting, you have to also understand your role in the emotional network when it comes to the way in which you're impacting the people around you, especially the children. So I think that those conversations are really, really tough. In my experience, talking about the future of work and the fact that everything else is obsolete and this is kind of the only sticky thing, it does appeal to a certain kind of like techie man who refuses to engage with any of it. And suddenly he's like, oh, this is a kind of a Bitcoin adjacent conversation. I'm joking a little. But anyway, so basically, it's real. It needs to be seen. It needs to be seen as a part of a general exchange. Everyone should take responsibility for it. Out in the workplace, it should be valued, and that means remuneration. But talking about it being valued in the private sphere does not necessarily mean remuneration. Although maybe if you're talking about sharing an income or whatever, maybe that is a conversation. It needs to be seen as the essential form of work alongside every other form of essential work. Because honestly, without it, the households, communities, families, again, would crumble. So it's a complicated conversation to have. I know that because I've had many conversations about it, and it's been complicated. I will say, as a kind of if we're thinking about, ladder steps to get to an ideal situation, I think that one of the positives of understanding it as real and valuable and part of the essential form of work that keeps communities, families, societies going, you needn't do the exact same. As long as one person isn't shouldering all of it and the other person, there can be households maybe where someone is slightly more outside of the house and maybe hasn't been trained to do it as much. And there can be grace and leniency there. I am a woman. I'm a cis het woman. I was trained, as you said at the beginning, to perform empathy. I have been trained and I have developed the skill of other-orientedness and emotional labor for years. So maybe when I'm talking to my partner about this, who really hasn't been trained for years, even if we can recognize that the ability is there and the skill set is there, there can be some grace as long as what I'm providing is completely centered and valued and part of not just something that's been extracted, but part of something that's been acknowledged and thanked and part of some form of reciprocity and open-ended mutuality.
Yes, I think absolutely that. In my own relationship with my husband, acknowledging it has been sort of a journey we've been on together, because I was not raised to be aware of its existence, or so he and I sort of learning together, figuring out what this thing is, and that I'm doing a lot of it. And I think for me, the piece that has been essential is that every step along the way, he values it equally, if not more than, the financial contributions he makes or the tangible, more tangible, practical things he makes. He values it. And for me, wherever we are on that journey of what mutuality looks like, or understanding it, or figuring out how to make things easier for me or whatever, that value piece has been everything. It's been essential. That's what makes me feel like he and I are partners while we are working through this and growing and evolving. And without that value piece, I can't imagine it feeling like a mutual relationship to me.
100%. I think there's a couple of things that sprung to mind as you were talking there. One is, so often, just as you said, it's not just about recognizing it or your partner recognizing it as you're doing it, or you recognizing it when someone else is doing it. Very often it starts with understanding and acknowledging when you're doing it yourself, because we have so been told that we should chronically be people pleasers, that so often, again, when I interviewed here women for the book, a lot of them would say, but I'm just a people pleaser. I was always like this. Well, even if you were always like this, that doesn't actually take away from the fact that you're providing a really important form of work that takes time, effort, and skill. People who are, this is the example for the stereotypical kind of backwards and forwards around these gendered conversations that can kind of sometimes feel like they're not going anywhere. We say that men, certainly up until a few decades ago, tended to be better at math, really because they're encouraged to see themselves as better at math. But if we are to accept the stereotype, which I do not, by the way, because lots of studies show this is, the gap is almost completely narrowed. We would never say to a man, oh, you're a data scientist working in tech, but you're just naturally better at math, so you shouldn't get paid.
Yeah.
Even in a private context, and if you think of physical labor, if a man spends 2 hours cutting down a tree, even if he's doing it within the context of this is a tree in the garden, we're not going to be well, you're stronger at it, so you didn't actually cut down that tree.
It wasn't work.
Right. And, even if that person's not going to get paid, we are going to say, hey, that was hard work. Thank you for, providing us with logs for the winter, whatever it is.
Yeah. Let me bring you some cool lemonade.
Seriously. So even if / when people say, oh, but women are just better at emotional labor. And even if we might say that to ourselves, because to be honest, as things stand, because we've been trained into doing it, so often we are better at it. That doesn't mean that it's not work. It doesn't mean that it's not valuable. It doesn't mean that it should not be seen and acknowledged and uplifted and part of some form of positive exchange.
Yes, yes. Throughout my life, like all of my friendships had tended to be, there wasn't a lot of mutuality, like, because my capacity was significant in this area. And I'm 40 now. And as like I started approaching 40, I started recognizing like, this is not working for me anymore. And I am not willing to invest in relationships where there is not a greater amount of mutuality. And that sort of like reverberated out, into other spheres, because then I had to force myself to like be aware of when I was doing it and how much I was doing it and where am I willing to and when am I not, and what does that feel like and look like to not do that labor, because that does not come naturally, to not do that labor when there is a space created for it. So what does that look like to lean back and not fill in that space? And that's been like a big growth edge for me, and like a really profound thing to realize how much of that is happening.
Totally. I think that thinking about emotional labor in friendships is actually huge. For many years, I lived in New York, and I was single on and off. And of course, being a continent away from my family, my friendships, were everything. And a lot of the work that I read as kind of foundation for emotional labor was various works by Bell Hooks, who really talks about love, but she talks about love with accountability. And I think even in friendships, especially in friendships, that love is not because it's not romantic love, that it should not have the same kind of scrutiny and accountability. Otherwise, it's not sustainable. It's not as I think it sounds like you've suddenly started deciding it is.
Yes.
And also, obviously, like there's a lot of friendships that are amazing that you don't need to, be distancing yourself from, including if you are someone who does a huge amount of emotional labor. There's a lot of other people out there who are doing emotional labor who are thrilled to meet fellow emotional laborers.
Yes.
And there's also, I guess one thing that I always try and say when I have conversations about emotional labor is growth is 100% possible. That goes back to the conversation about the plasticity of the brain. It goes back to the conversation about the fact these are all human skills, that we all have the ability to learn new tricks as humans. Actually, for the rest of our lives, we will have that ability. So, if a situation or a dynamic or a relationship isn't quite where it needs to be, that doesn't mean that it's condemned, as long as the people who are in the relationship, whether it's romantic or not, are willing to have the conversation and are willing to put themselves through, a growth journey.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of times, particularly in like cishet relationships, like the mother, the wife tries to do the work for the partner, and like we can't do that. So just like, if we can sort of lean back and create that space where we're not filling it all in anymore, and then invite conversations about that, and invite, like we can invite, like, and that's kind of where our sphere of ownership ends. We really can't do more than that for someone else if they're not willing.
Totally. And actually, this is also a great segue into me. A lot of people, when they first hear about emotional labor, because it's really only a term that's been permeating mainstream conversations very, very recently, a lot of people will immediately go to what has been slightly more central to mainstream conversations, which is conversations around codependency. And I want to be really careful if anyone listening had that thought. There is a way in which understanding attachment styles is extraordinarily useful and empowering. And there is a way, like so often in individualized psychology, when it's easier to just say to the individual, oh, this is what you need to change, and then everything will sort itself out. Mm-hmm. Here you're talking about a system, a whole system that's been built to render this form of work invisible and devalued so that it can be extracted at a discount or for free. So I would be I would encourage people to be self-critical, but also gracious with themselves. And if they are ever told, oh, you're being codependent, in other words, it's your fault for taking responsibility for the emotions of the people around you. And it's just up to you to stop taking that responsibility on. I would encourage people to really think, to what degree is that true? To what degree, if I stopped doing that, would everything around me crumble? Because I think for a lot of women, whether it's in cishet relationships, in family dynamics with children, or even, so many of our generation are taking care of parents, we are very aware that if we do not do this form of work, no one else is going to do it.
Yeah.
And so I think I get very upset when generations of women are told that it's our fault for being codependent, when actually it's not. Thank goodness we're taking on this work because no one else is. And yes, at the same time, ideally, in relationships between adults, boundaries are placed so that it's not eternally one person extracting and relying on the other person, and then eternally the other person giving, because of course that is destructive to everyone really involved.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, if you could inspire change on a societal scale, what would that change be? What would it look like? How can we get there? Set us on the path to a new world, Rose. No pressure.
Nothing less. If I'm just doing the whole thing, which it sounds like, okay, I'm head of emotional labor department at the White House. Let me see. Policy-wise, we desperately need universal childcare. And even if it means empowering families who are taking care of their, young children, we do not have a proper universal childcare system. It is very shocking to me as a European, honestly. Not that Europe is at all perfect, but the most valuable assets we have in the society is the future generation. We need to do it so that we can really support parents as they make whatever choices that they want to make. Obviously, we also need parental leave, not just for women, but for men too, because we need men to bond with their children so that they can take on the emotional labor, and so that we're not creating those cycles where, because of information deficit, men don't quite know what to do when a toddler is, crying in this way versus that way. And so it's always the default mother in so many situations that has to kind of take on all of the small details. So parental leave, actual universal childcare, not just nominal, because that would be valuing the emotional labor, whether it's caregivers outside of the home who are there for it, or caregivers within the home. This is the next step is, I think we need better imagination in terms of what it means to support emotional laborers and caregivers in this society, especially as the jobs that we thought were never going to go start leaving. And I don't really see any other solution. And I'm thrilled to have conversations about it with people, but I don't see any other solution except for figuring out some kind of universal basic income. Because jobs are disappearing, and we live in a society where we need money to pay for our lives. And we also live in the richest nation in the history of all nations. So to me, and maybe this is more my outsider perspective, we need kind of big, bold policies that aren't punishing people for doing the essential work that societies and economies rely on. So that's what I would do. And I would also have a value shift to no longer just saying the biggest form of, the best forms of trait are just competition and assertiveness and aggression. I think if anyone looks around them right now in the world, it's hard to really justify that. I think we need to understand that what makes us special as human beings is our ability to collaborate and live in community. And I think that those are the values that we need to recenter so that we can actually not annihilate each other and the earth. You wanted big, I give you big.
Yes. Okay. I'll send that up the flagpole. Keep your phone nearby. We'll see what we can do.
But I think, what's nice about this is it might seem all very daunting, but I think that conversations like these can really start to spread, like everyone listening and engaging. And I wrote this book as a kind of a beginning, hoping that lots of people would pick up whatever it is that's relevant to them and kind of run with it in their own way. And, over the last 6 months, the conversations that I'm increasingly having have been very promising. And I think there's a lot of other people who are doing similar work, so including you. And so, I am very hopeful that this might seem kind of overwhelming and daunting, but there's huge power, not just in what we do, but in the ways in which we internalize these new values and can, spread the words ourselves.
Yeah. And I think as parents, we experience one of our greatest powers in terms of changing the world in how we raise our kids. Like that my kids were raised, with a heavy value placed on emotional intelligence and emotional labor. And then I'm hoping they will go out into the world and, spread that value system and, those skills become contagious with their friends and in their relationships and in their workplaces. And, so for those of you out there that are feeling like this is big, how can I, where do I start? Just, you can start right in your parenting, like with everything that we talk about here, and just know that it's really important and it's really impactful. And this matters and can make the world definitely a better place.
Totally. And just to reiterate what I was saying earlier, start with yourself and giving yourself the honor and value that you deserve.
Oh, that's beautiful. Okay. The show notes can be found at sagefamily.com/podcast94, where you can also subscribe and get future show notes sent right to your inbox. So what, Rose, are your favorite resources for people to dive deeper into this topic?
Oh, goodness. I did not prepare this. I mean, obviously the book that I wrote.
Yes. The book that you wrote. Talk about that. And your TikTok is like one of my favorite TikTok accounts. I am obsessed with it. I follow you. Whenever your little face pops up on my screen, I get like this jolt of ooh, here we go. I get all happy. So definitely everyone should follow you there.
That's very good. That's been an amazing, honestly, that's been an amazing resource. I feel like being on Instagram, I am more on TikTok just because that seemed to be where I went over the last few months. There are so many people who are doing incredible work, who are sharing not just their own skill sets, but also their own individual stories that have such a huge impact on everyone around them. I guess I can give you a favorite book. Can I do that?
Yes, absolutely.
just because I mentioned bell hooks, feel like bell hooks, I've had a lot of men tell me that reading bell hooks has made them feel not just seen, but that there is a road for redemption. I mean, she speaks specifically to Black men, but a lot of white men I've also spoken to have found her very just piercing and not just condemning. There's a lot of love in the way in which she wrote. It's very sad that she's no longer with us. So maybe that would be a good resource if you're wondering how you can coax your male partner into self-liberation. I would recommend the wonderful bell hooks.
Love it. Thank you so much, Rose, for coming on and for having this conversation with me. You are amazing. Your work is amazing. Please keep showing up out there, and I will keep cheering you on and sharing far and wide everything that you put out there. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you.